Okay, welcome back. I am Marc Applebaum, and I'm back again with my friend and colleague Scott Churchill to continue our conversation centered on his book, Essentials of Existential Phenomenological Research. And we were talking before recording on opening up but perhaps unfortunately controversial topic, which is the arguments over description and interpretation. So how would you characterize this issue? How should we get our arms around this controversy?
I think the I think this is like there's an elephant in the room when we talk about
Yeah.
description and interpretation. And that elephant is that the big battle or the distinction, the bifurcation, the controversy comes down to two men, maybe three men. And I'm saying this with a little bit of a sense of humor as I say that, but it really does have to do with the
Mm.
fact that it all began with one man, Amedeo Giorgi, who was reading Edmund Husserl, and he noticed that Husserl called his work essentially a descriptive psychology. Descriptive
Mm.
psychology. And Andy, coming fresh from Fordham, where he was trained in experimental psychology, just loved this idea of a descriptive psychology. That goes back to the roots of the history of psychology with Wundt and others at the turn of the previous century. So he took up the
Mm.
mantle of descriptive phenomenology. Uh, Almost simultaneously, or a few years later, in Canada, Max von Manen, in the School of Pedagogy, who was trained in the Utrecht School in the Netherlands as a student
Yeah.
with Jan Vandenberg as his teacher. He was taking up a kind of phenomenology that we were doing at Duquesne. Ironically, Giorgi brought Vandenberg to Duquesne, and we listened to Vandenberg's lectures. And Vandenberg had a way of distinguishing description and explanation. He would say explanations
Mm-hmm.
emerge when description has stopped too soon.
Vandenberg's book, A Different Existence, is
Yes,
excellent.
I ended up using it almost every semester in my last 20, 30 years there. I started at the beginning with it. It went out of print. And then I said, I got to help get this back into print. So I told the Duquesne Press,
Yeah.
if you'll bring it back,
Yeah.
I'll use it. So anyway, so what happens is Van Manen doesn't want to stand under another man's umbrella and climb up the mountain and be part of Giorgi's, project. So Van Manen, who's also a strong personality like Andy is, said, "I'm going to call my work hermeneutic." Now, interestingly, if you read his 1990 book, I always get the title wrong. I think it's something like Researching Lived Experience, but whatever it is on method, you get to that chapter, 5 or 6 chapters in, where he's going to discuss the difference between phenomenology and hermeneutics. And he finally says, sometimes I say hermeneutics, sometimes I say phenomenology. In the end, they
Right.
mean the same to him. So
Yeah.
when you find out that the person who distinguished his work from Giorgi by calling it hermeneutic really doesn't recognize a difference between what those words mean, practically speaking, I think that's telling. He was just saying, I'm going to give my way of doing phenomenology a different brand name. And that's where this
Mm.
whole argument began, is that there was the branding of methods. And then Jonathan Smith comes along and decides he wants to change the name of his method from interpretive psychological analysis, IPA, in 2001. Within a year or two, he'd heard the word phenomenological and said, wow, that has a nice ring to it. He told me this when I first met him. He didn't realize he picked a hornet's nest. So he replaced
Yeah.
the P word, the psychology, with phenomenological, and now his method is called interpretative phenomenological method. But he spent the last
Mm.
20 years, to his credit, retrofitting that method, retrofitting the philosophy to his method. So his method
Yeah.
wasn't developed out of phenomenology or hermeneutics. His method
Well,
was
that's something we can clearly say about Giorgi and Van Manen. They're both intensely engaged with the philosophy, for sure.
exactly, and they're the tradition that you and I come out of, and we both of us were. You were a
Yeah.
student of Giorgi. I was a student of Giorgi's student Calesi, as well as
Yeah.
Giorgi, but it was his student Calesi who
Right.
first developed this empirical method, so to speak. So
Yeah.
what happens is that you have two men who are different from each other, and therefore the branded name of the research method descriptive phenomenology and hermeneutic phenomenology appear to be categorical differences, like a categorical distinction, because one man is not the same as the
Right.
other. My next step is I'm going to pull up this quote I wrote to Rokas Zoa. This is the guy who's the editor and curator of Husserliana, the Gesamte Werke, the we have to re-record this probably. Do you want let's
Maybe
say
not, because we're in psychology. For the philosophers in the room, yes, they will know fully what we're talking about. The Husserliana is what we're talking about. The collection of Husserl's work. For people from a psychology background, this is the textual guardianship of Husserl's legacy in philosophy.
So when I raised the question with him was about 13, 14 years ago, when he came to the US to give a lecture on the life world, which was the second part of the crisis that never got published and never got transcribed into English. So he sent me a paragraph, which I have here in front of me, because he said, it's kind of funny to see in your subject heading, description versus interpretation. He said, Husserl would not recognize that there was any such thing as a versus, a contradiction between the two.
This is probably shocking, because if you let it in, that a Husserl scholar would say, there's no distinction here between the words interpretation and description, because you may be thinking as a student, these are two completely different things.
Part of this history is that it started circulating in the secondary literature that you can either be descriptive or interpretive. And I should say, to Giorgi's credit, when I was a student of his, what he didn't want when we came into the research classroom with our analyses of data, we were also reading a lot of psychoanalysis, everything from Freud and Jung to Horney and Sullivan. So students would come in and they would see defense mechanisms. They would see, they would inject terminology from theoreticians like Freud into their analyses. And Giorgi didn't want any theory, not even Heidegger or Sartre, to be infiltrating our analysis of data. So to his credit, he said, leave your interpretations at the door. So by interpretation, he meant that what it usually means in English in psychology is that you're using a theoretical system as a framework of understanding. Now, what Husserl really said in the preface to the Ideas Volume 1, a preface that he wrote specifically for the English reader when he knew that this guy Gibson was going to be translating his book. It didn't come out until the 60s, but in the 30s, Husserl wrote this preface because he wanted to make sure that the American audience, the English-speaking audience, including England, did not make a mistake as to what this phenomenology was about. And in that preface, he clarifies the meaning of the epoche, of the bracketing of preconceptions. And it was only the bracketing of the naturalistic prejudice, the naturalistic attitude, not the natural attitude, but within the natural attitude of believing that the world actually is the way it appears to me. There are scientists who believe that the psyche is actually the way it appears to the psychologist who does experiments. And he said, the first thing we got to get out of the way are naturalistic biases. He never said you had to bracket everything that you know. In fact, before Heidegger used the term Vorhaben in German, Husserl used it as well to refer to all that we bring with us, to the encounter with the world as the lenses through which we describe things. So, so here's the statement from Husserl. This is what we mean by interpretation. And I'm the translator here. I've got the German, but not a seemingly arbitrary interpretation, but rather one that exhibits the unfolding of a clearly discernible intentionality. Moreover, such an unfolding is from the very outset interpretation. And all analysis of intentionality, all self-understanding of consciousness that finds its expression in description is interpretation, in all of its obviousness. The interpretation is precisely a self-evident interpretation, which means it's a description grounded in evidence, which is therefore primordially constitutive of meaning. So, in other words, for Husserl, from the very outset, when we as phenomenologists are engaged in describing an experience, we are already interpreting what is evidently unfolding before our very eyes as a clearly discernible intentionality. That is
Yeah.
to say, intentionality for Husserl is first accessed by means of interpretation, which only then
Yeah.
finds its expression in description.
Yeah.
So, this is
Yeah.
really paramount, that from the horse's mouth himself, because usually we say, oh, it's Heidegger who says famously that all description is already interpretation. And there, Heidegger
Yeah.
is only paraphrasing his teacher, Husserl. But this gets
Yeah.
repeated over and over again in this current world
Yeah.
where we don't live in a truth-based world, is what people say. Oh, for Husserl, it's description. For Heidegger, it's interpretation. And the answer is no. Both Husserl and Heidegger
Yeah.
are.
And I think for students who come in as beginners, it's already a learning task to help students awaken to all of the assumptions they already have cooking in the background from the theories. And you mentioned this last time. All the theories that they've got cooking in the background from previous courses or just from being in the culture. So just to realize their presuppositions or their own pet theories about why they think something happens the way it does. That meaning of interpretation, yes, that this is what we want to be responsible for. This is what we want to be aware of. Not even necessarily negate it, but set it aside. So there's that kind of bracketing.
Yes.
But if we look at interpretation as finding meaning, unfolding meaning, discovering the meaning in what's given to us, this is what Husserl and Heidegger, as far as I understand, and this are talking about here.
And the other beauty of it is that there are, not the beauty, but the interesting linguistic fact is that in German, there are at least 5 German terms that are each routinely translated as interpretation, which shows us that the German language is much more discerning, is much more specific in its use of terminology, because Husserl and Heidegger use all of those 5 words. And in English, we only have one word to deal with all of them. Let me give you a very profound example because it's relevant to psychology.
Sure.
Everyone knows that probably Freud's most famous book is The Interpretation of Dreams. Would you agree? In 1901, actually, his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, 1901, and that's the same year as Husserl's Logical Investigations, 1900, 1901 is when it was coming out. Here are 2 Jewish thinkers who, at the turn of the century, wrote their magnum opus, and the most important books, perhaps, of the 20th century. So the interpretation of dreams, Bruno Bettelheim tells us, should not have been translated as the interpretation of dreams. And when you think about it, when people say, oh, Freud, he was a real stick in the mud, only his interpretation was correct because he would say there's only one way to interpret a dream, and that's my way. Well, the way, the Weg, W-E-G in German, that's one of Heidegger's favorite words. What is the way, the path, the method, the mode of access to something? Die Traumdeutung, one word, the Traumdeutung. It's a compound word in German. It's not the Interpretation des Träumen. It's die Traumdeutung. And what that means is the attempt to search for the meaning of dreams. The attempt to grasp is the word that Bettelheim uses. Deuten, the German verb, means to attempt to grasp at meaning. The attempt, and so what is the one way to attempt to grasp at the meaning of dreams for Freud's was through free association on the part of the patient and through a kind of interpretive stance on the part of the analyst. So the interpretation of dreams had to do with following the lead of the patient and listening for a clearly discernible intentionality in the dream. Think about the original meaning of dream interpretation, where wish fulfillment. What is a wish but an intention? And when we get to Freud's next major work, which was the case of Dora, 1905, in the introduction, he's got 3 paragraphs where there are 3 words italicized at the bottom of each page. And he says, we have to search for the meaning of the symptom. And then a page later, he's saying, that is, we're looking for the motive of the illness. And finally, on the third page, he says, in other words, we must find the intention that lies at the bottom of the symptom.
Yeah.
Husserl and Freud were both taught by Franz Brentano, who's the one who
Yeah.
coined
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
expression intentionality. So, but there was
Yeah.
Freud listening for a clearly discernible intentionality, and that was what he did in his interpretation. So it's kind of a shame that it's come to this categorical distinction. You find it in books that are the one we held up last week, where the person who wrote the book had a chapter on Calesi, Giorgi, Van Manen, Smith. And at the end, she's saying, well, if you want to do this kind of research, you should use Calesi. If you want to do that kind of research, you should use Giorgi. But Giorgi's method grew out of his students' work. And someone else published a book where I have a chapter on phenomenological analysis, a strictly Husserlian approach. And the next chapter is called Hermeneutic Phenomenology. The author was my student, who was then at Duquesne, and she wrote, and when you realize that it's incestuous, we are all related to each other, we're learning from each other. Heidegger learned from Husserl, and so how can you say that Heidegger and Husserl are categorically apart?
Well, I mean, I think if we pan way out, like we're in a society that's obsessed with branding in the first place, and market segmentation. I hate to put it that way, but I think to a certain degree, people are so used to brand X versus brand Y, and to grasp, because I think what you're really describing here is a diverse tradition that includes multiple different viewpoints, and I think we'll even maybe get into a little bit more of that between you and me in terms of how we look at descriptive interviewing and interviewing that, to my mind, would be more self-consciously interpretive. That's a trailer for upcoming part of this conversation, I think. But I think among my students, there's something of a tendency to look for an easy handle, and it's this versus that, especially if students feel pressured to, okay, what method am I going to choose? What method am I going to choose? I have to choose a method next semester, right? Am I going to do the interpretive class or am I going to do the descriptive class?
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and to be fair, like I don't expect my students to necessarily have a philosophical interest, but that's how I got here. So, I find this critical because of all viewing the phenomenological and hermeneutic tradition as a tradition that includes all these diverse viewpoints is, to me, a much more reality-based, but also generous way to look at what's going on.
Yeah. Part of the irony is that I'll be at a conference like at APA, and there'll be a panel discussion going on, and we're talking about different methodologies, and I'll be asked to present something about phenomenological research, and a grad student will raise their hand in earnest and say, so how is this different from IPA? And I don't, I actually didn't want to tell the truth in the answer to that publicly. So I kind of skirted around it. But the real answer to the question is that IPA was not grounded in the literature of phenomenology or hermeneutics. It's been retrofit to that literature in the last 20 years. But at the origins of it, and it hasn't changed in principle from what the method was 25 years ago. Like I said, the branding spread to the APA series because when my first draft of my book, the title was Doing Psychology Phenomenologically. And the subtitle was An Invitation to Empathic Understanding. And the series editors just put strike through and said, your title needs to name your method. And they wanted acronyms. And so when I asked Giorgi, should I use empirical phenomenological research? I've got to say something other than phenomenological analysis because they've already got a chapter on IPA. And he said, existential phenomenological research would be perfectly descriptive. So from the master himself, that man had his best.
Yeah, and I think that it's important, for anyone listening who's not already embedded in the phenomenological tradition, by which I mean the philosophical tradition, not acquainted with that part of it. There's a wide variety of ways to do qualitative research, a wide diversity of legitimate ways to do qualitative. So that's not the issue that Scott and I are on about right now. It's more the connection to this particular philosophical tradition or not that I think we're really like grappling with.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
here's a
Yeah. Yeah.
more poignant distinction I will make. Edmund
Mm.
Husserl was not studying texts. Edmund Husserl was not
Right.
collecting data. He wasn't collecting
Right.
descriptions. He wasn't
Right.
outsourcing the most important
Right.
culminating moment of phenomenology, because the curator of
Yeah.
phenomenology, Herbert Spiegelberg, in his massive book, The Phenomenological Movement, in the end of the
Right.
book, pages 600, 700, he's got what is the method? Intuition, analysis, and description. And they're not in that order. They're all happening at the same time. But that's what, how do we use intuition? And intuition doesn't mean hunches. The German for
Yeah.
intuition, Anschauung, means to look at something, to be present to
Yeah.
something, to encounter something,
Directly present to something.
directly present
In
to
an
something.
in an unmediated way. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
only mediated by your forehaving, but
Right.
not
Right.
mediated by explanatory, interpretations, not mediated by, yeah. So what
Present to
Husserl,
what's present to me. Really present to what's given to me as it's given. Yeah.
yeah. So
Without bringing in a theoretical lens to interposing the lens between me and what's present.
that's beautifully stated. Yes, we do not mediate our descriptions of what's
Right.
immediately present. So what was
That's it.
Husserl describing? He's in his attic looking out the window at his children playing on the ground. And he's describing the natural attitude of his, doesn't doubt for a
Yeah.
moment, those are his kids down there. He believes that.
Right.
What he's
Yeah.
describing is his perception. And when he does his analyses of fantasies, he's performing a reflective analysis on his own fantasy life. And when he's doing a reflection on remembering, he engages in an
Yeah.
act of remembering, and then he reflects on that act of remembering to ask, what is the difference between remembering something and imagining something? And what's the difference
Yeah.
between imagining something and perceiving something? So what Husserl was looking for at the eidetic level were kinds of intuitions, perceptions, imaginations, remembering, and Heidegger was studying texts. Heidegger was reading the philosophers. He was reading Aristotle, Nietzsche, Kant, and the books that he wrote were on their works. And
Right.
he had the challenge of, how do I understand the words used by someone else to describe their
Mm.
philosophy? So his challenge was immediately hermeneutic, because that's the ancient science, you might say, the art of interpreting words. So when you
Yeah.
collect
Plus, he started out
verbatim,
with a clerical education. He was studying religion in the first place before he ended up as a philosopher, if I understand properly. So hermeneutics, in terms of biblical textual hermeneutics, was already there for
it
him.
was already there. That was kind of the origin of the use of that term. So one of the
Yeah.
another elephant in the room is that when we're talking about qualitative research, we're talking about doing research where our starting point is somebody's description of their experience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's description based. But
Yeah.
what are we doing when we're reading their words? And when I had a conversation on the phone with Andy about this, he said, well, where's your
Mm.
phenomenological sense? He said, they're not just words on a page. We fill them out with our imagination. I said, but what if your imagination doesn't correspond to what the person actually experienced? He said, that doesn't matter, because I'm only interested in the general. Like Husserl, I'm only interested in the eidetic understanding. And even if I'm off in some of the details that pertain to this particular person's experience, when I imaginatively fill it out in order to
Mm.
get to the essence, for Husserl, as
Yeah.
long as I, the researcher, am a human subject, then my intuitions have apodictic certainty.
Well,
So
because we live in a shared human world, and if I'm interviewing somebody about, for example, like the loss of a loved one, I'm also a human who may or may not have lost a loved one, but at least I live in a world where that's something that's already a possibility for me, if not an actual experience of mine.
that's
So
exactly, yes.
this intersubjectivity is always there that way for us, I think.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So, when we're reading the words as our data, it
Hmm.
puts us necessarily into what Heidegger and Husserl call a hermeneutic situation. In fact, that's the subtitle of some of Heidegger's early lecture courses when they were published.
Hmm.
Initiation into the hermeneutic situation. That's the subtitle of his Introduction to Phenomenological Research. Initiation
Hmm.
into the hermeneutic situation. because the situation of the researcher, when you're encountering texts, words written, spoken by someone, Freud listening to the patient, your data are the words. The manifest dream is the dream as spoken to the analyst.
Yeah.
And you're trying to get to the original dream. The latent dream is the goal of psychoanalysis. So what is the original experience to which a participant's description points? That's something that Herbert Spiegelberg is also precise on. He says we must remember that the description, the analysis is an analysis not of the description, but of the experience to which a description points. So we're trying to get back to that clearly unfolding intentionality that was there in the experience by someone as originally. And that's what Schutz says when he says we should put ourselves into the attitude of the present moment, because only in the living moment do the in order to motives become apparent to either the actor or a researcher listening in.
Yeah. Sometimes I have students who it's as if they think their task is to capture an empirically accurate description of the original experience that's being described by the people they interview. So I had a student who did a dissertation on an experience of people's experiences of praying and feeling answered, their prayers being answered. Okay. So a student in that case might assume that they're trying to get to, like a photograph almost of a moment in time, past time, of that actual event. I think that what we're gathering is the story that's told in the here and now to the interviewer. So it's the meaning for the person right now as they recollect that experience. So I think we're in contact with the meaning for them today of the past event.
Definitely, for sure, that's the case. And it's one reason why when police are doing investigations, they want to catch the person as quickly as possible. They want to separate the people from each other so they don't share their story. They want to get the unadulterated, immediate, as close to the moment of the action as possible. And when you're doing it later, you're almost automatically doing a study at that point of the remembrance of this experience, the remembrance of the trauma.
Yeah. Well, the remembrance in that like empirical sense of memory, I suppose, but also the meaning that is meaningful today for me of what happened 10, 5, 20 years ago, which is this is the human part of it that I really want to try to impress on people when I'm teaching, which is we're not failing the aim of research if what we're capturing is the meaning today of a past experience versus somehow traveling back in time and capturing the meaning. Like in a court case, this would be critical. The example you just gave is really, the empirical facts matter tremendously. That's what the case is trying to settle. But in our case, if it's the loss, I'm just going to stick with this example. If it's the loss of the loved one that happened 20 years ago, let's say, to the person who's telling us that story, our interest, the story we're gathering is the sort of accumulated or sedimented or digested meaning of that past event for that person that's with them today, having lived with that loss for 20 years. And that's the full humanity of that experience. So it's not a failing that we're getting that meaning, which is undoubtedly developed over those years. But we're studying the here and now.
And that's
the way that memory lives on for them and what it means now versus what it might have meant then. Something like that.
No, you got it. You nailed it. And that's exactly what our students who become therapists will be doing, because they're going to be listening to the narrative of today, not what actually happened.
Exactly.
That's also the difference between two German words for experience, and we only have experience. But Erlebnis, from erleben, the verb, where Leben is living and Erleben is what comes out of living, experience of the moment, and Erfahrung, which is the term of Husserl's last work, Erfahrung und Urteil, experience and judgment. And it's also the word that Heidegger uses most often. He rarely uses Erlebnis. which usually
Mm.
Husserl used because when he wanted to reflect on a perception, he would look out the window
Hmm.
and describe it. He wanted a
Yeah.
moment within the flow of time, a moment within the flow of consciousness was an Erlebnis. Erfahrung,
Yeah.
from the German verb fahren, traveling, journeying,
Uh, uh-huh,
is
uh-huh.
what comes out of life, what comes out of the
Yeah.
course of life. And that's what we are
Yeah.
usually studying when we ask someone to describe. And ironically, we often ask a
Yeah.
participant, at least in our
Great.
tradition at Duquesne and the University of Dallas, our students will say, think back to a time. And I'm thinking of the Dave Letterman show when they would do this like wavy thing over his face when he's like, what happened back then? And then they would recreate
Right.
something.
Right.
Think back to a
Right.
time when you were angry, and they pick
Yes.
something 20
Yeah.
years ago. That's not the living
Yeah.
moment anymore. So you're only getting a narrative. But I'm going to tell you where it becomes really poignant.
Mm.
Dr. Fisher Smith, Amy Fisher Smith, my colleague, and I wrote a chapter recently on resilience. And we were quoting from Frankl and also from some research that she was involved in with the Yazidi women, who were the women who
Uh-huh.
were
Yeah.
captured, kidnapped, tortured, and sexually assaulted by the ISIS uh, individuals.
In
Later,
Iraq.
when they were
Yeah.
being interviewed, they said
Mm.
things like, I guess what we were doing when we were enduring all of the torture and the horrors that we went through, we were preserving our culture. We were preserving our sense of our cultural identity by refusing to give
Hmm.
in. Now, if you went back to the moment of someone being
Yeah.
tortured and put a microphone there and said, I need a description of your experience, they're not going to be saying, well, I'm struggling to preserve my cultural identity. They're going to
Right.
be,
Right.
they're not going to be able to speak. They may even be dissociating in that moment of horror.
Right.
But later,
Right.
the meaningfulness, when they look back on their past and tried to make sense of it, something Frankl calls rescuing into the past. No one can take away from you what you suffered, and no one can take away from you how you understand that
Hmm.
today, that you were preserving your
Yeah.
cultural identity. You have
Yeah.
rescued that into the past, and you can never have that taken away from you. And you read Frankl, and it leaves you in tears the way he puts it. So that
Hmm.
moment that you're describing of later on giving meaning, grasping at meaning, the
Yeah.
attempt to grasp at the meaning of something that was meaningless, of something that was a horror,
Yeah.
that only has that meaning now in retrospect. We can only talk
Right.
about resilience in retrospect. We can only talk about commitment in retrospect as opposed to something to aspire to. There are these terms that
Right.
we use that are psychological, interpersonal experiences, and they refer to what has been that has to be seen from a distance. So, built into our methodology is the collection of descriptions in the present that pertain to the past. And we don't
Yeah.
deceive ourselves into thinking that what the description today gives us is exactly what was undergone 20 years ago. So,
Yeah. Great. I can I can see our next move in this coming on the horizon, and I think this would be a good place to pause the conversation
sure.
once more, and
Yeah, this is
regather
always
next
fun
time.
chatting together. Yeah,
Excellent. Thank you.
you bet.